On November 25th, 1177, a dying 16-year-old boy with bandaged hands and 500 knights faced down 26,000 of Islam's finest warriors. By sunset, the most powerful Muslim army in the world lay shattered, and history's most unlikely military genius had written his legend in blood. Think about those numbers for a second. 500 against 26,000, that's a 52-to-1 disadvantage. The fate of Christian civilization in the Holy Land hung by a thread so thin it was invisible. Yet by the end of this video, you'll understand how a teenage leper king achieved the impossible. Why Saladin, the greatest Muslim commander of the age, made the fatal error that cost him everything, and what really happened in those savage moments when faith collided with steel. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will change how you see medieval warfare forever. First, the secret signal that turned certain death into total victory. Second, why Saladin's elite bodyguard fled on camels, abandoning their legendary leader. And third, the haunting final words between Baldwin and Saladin that history tried to forget. But here's what makes this story truly unbelievable. How did Baldwin even hold a sword with advanced leprosy eating away his flesh? What tactical mistake did Saladin make that no historian saw coming? Why did Muslim chroniclers themselves call this battle a divine punishment? How could seasoned Mamluk cavalry warriors who'd never known defeat break before teenage knights? How could 90% of an army simply vanish in one afternoon? This is the story of the masked king who couldn't feel pain versus the sultan who had never known defeat. To understand how 500 men destroyed an empire's might, we need to step back to when Jerusalem itself was preparing for the end. The year 1177 marked the darkest hour for the Crusader kingdoms. For nearly 8 decades, Christian knights had clung to their precarious footholds in the Holy Land, but now the tide was turning, and turning fast. The great Crusader fortresses that once dominated the landscape were falling one by one, their defenders overwhelmed by a resurgent Islamic world united under one man, Saladin. But in Jerusalem, something extraordinary occupied the throne. Baldwin IV, crowned at 13, carried a curse that should have killed him years ago. Leprosy, the disease medieval minds saw as God's own judgment. By 16, his body was failing. His hands, wrapped in silk bandages, could barely grip a sword. His face, hidden behind a silver mask, concealed features ravaged by disease. Courtiers whispered he was cursed by God, yet somehow, impossibly, he ruled with a clarity that stunned friend and foe alike. They called him the Leper King, the boy who shouldn't be alive, much less leading armies. Facing him stood Saladin, the sword of Islam, a leader who combined military genius with genuine piety. At 40, he'd united Egypt and Syria, forging the most powerful Muslim state since the early caliphates. His army had crushed every force sent against it. His reputation alone could empty castles without firing a shot. While Baldwin fought his own decaying body, Saladin commanded an empire stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates. The power dynamic was laughably one-sided. The Crusader states, fractured by internal rivalries, could muster perhaps 15,000 men, total scattered across dozens of castles and cities. Saladin commanded over 100,000 warriors, with the wealth of Egypt funding endless campaigns. It wasn't a question of if the Crusaders would fall, but when. Jerusalem's nobles already made secret preparations for exile. Ships waited in the ports. Treaties were quietly negotiated. The smart money said the Kingdom of Jerusalem had months, maybe weeks. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you. Baldwin IV wasn't just fighting Saladin. He was racing against his own body, knowing each battle might be his last, each victory purchased with agony no healthy man could endure. As autumn turned to winter in 1177, intelligence reports brought terrifying news. Saladin was massing the largest army of his career, 26,000 mounted warriors, including his elite Mamluk cavalry. Their destination was obvious, Jerusalem itself. The city's garrison numbered less than 1,000 men. The arithmetic of annihilation was simple. But as Saladin's massive host swept north like a plague of locusts, something unprecedented was stirring in Jerusalem's throne room. Inside Jerusalem's throne room, Baldwin IV faced a decision that would define history. His advisors begged him to flee. A Leper King of 16 had no business leading a last stand. But Baldwin, carried to the war council on a litter because walking had become agony, spoke with a voice that made hardened crusaders weep. "I may die tomorrow or in 10 years, but I will die as I lived, defending this kingdom." The mathematics of survival were brutal. Baldwin could muster only 500 knights, including 80 Knights Templar, warrior monks who took vows to never retreat, never surrender, never show mercy to Islam's warriors. Supporting them were barely 3,000 infantry, many of them local levies with more courage than training. Together, they faced annihilation. Saladin's host was something from an apocalyptic vision. 26,000 mounted warriors, including 8,000 Mamluk slave soldiers trained from childhood in the arts of war, each worth 3 ordinary cavalry in battle. The Muslim chroniclers described it as an ocean of steel and faith. The supply train alone stretched for miles, evidence of Saladin's confidence. He wasn't planning a raid. He was planning conquest. What happened next shocked both Christian and Muslim chroniclers. Baldwin, despite hands so damaged he needed help putting on armor, insisted on personally leading the army. Templars wept openly as their king was lifted onto his horse, his body strapped to the saddle because his legs could no longer grip. The silver mask hiding his ravaged features gleamed in the November sun. "Look at me," Baldwin told his assembled knights. "God gave me this disease so that when we achieve victory, no man can claim it was by human strength alone." Saladin, camped near Ascalon, received reports of Baldwin's pathetic force with amusement. His emirs were already dividing up the conquered lands among themselves. Why shouldn't they be confident? The Sultan had gathered the largest Muslim army since the First Crusade. His scouts reported Jerusalem's walls were barely manned. The kingdom's best knights were scattered in distant fortresses. But Saladin made one fatal assumption, that Baldwin would wait behind Jerusalem's walls. The geography itself favoured the Muslims. The lands around Montgisard offered perfect terrain for cavalry, rolling hills and open plains where numbers would tell. The autumn rains hadn't yet begun, meaning firm ground for charging horses. Every military manual, every precedent of warfare said the same thing. In open battle, the larger force wins, always. On November 23rd, Saladin bypassed the fortress of Ascalon, ignoring its garrison. Why waste time on sieges when Jerusalem itself lay defenseless? His army spread out, confident and eager, already tasting victory. Foraging parties scattered across the countryside, discipline relaxed. After all, what threat could 500 knights pose to 26,000? But hidden in the morning mist of November 25th, Baldwin's force had left Jerusalem in a desperate march. 45 miles in 36 hours, an insane pace for healthy men, torture for a king whose body was literally falling apart. Templars took turns carrying Baldwin's litter when he lost consciousness from pain. They marched not to defend Jerusalem, but to find the one thing that might save it, Saladin's army in the worst possible position. As the two forces converged, neither side knew they were racing toward the most shocking military reversal in medieval history. November 25th dawned clear and hot, unusual for late autumn in the Levant. By 6 a.m., Baldwin's exhausted force had covered impossible ground, their horses foaming, men swaying with fatigue. But their scouts brought electrifying news. Saladin's army was spread across 3 miles of countryside, scattered in foraging parties, their guard completely down. The Templar Grand Master, Odo de Streetamand, rode to Baldwin's litter. "Sire, God has delivered them into our hands." But even he couldn't hide his shock at what their scouts reported next. The enemy numbers were even worse than feared. Not 20,000, but 26,000 warriors, their banners blackening the horizon like a storm front. Baldwin's knights reacted with visible despair. Some openly wept, others prayed. The mathematics were impossible, 52 enemies for every Christian knight. But then Baldwin did something no one expected. Despite agony that would have killed most men, he demanded to be lifted from his litter and placed on his horse. "Gentlemen," His voice rang clear despite his suffering. David faced Goliath with faith. We faced 26,000 with God. At 11 a.m., Saladin received his first warning dust clouds to the north, moving fast. His initial reaction was disbelief. The reports made no sense. Baldwin wouldn't dare leave Jerusalem's walls. It had to be a scouting party, nothing more. This overconfidence would cost him everything. By noon, the truth became undeniable. Crusader banners appeared on the ridgeline, the blood-red cross of the Templars, the golden crosses of Jerusalem. Saladin's scattered forces began frantically trying to reform their lines, but 3 miles is a long distance when your enemy is charging at full gallop. Here's where it gets almost unbelievable. Military logic demanded Baldwin wait, let Saladin organize, then retreat to defensible ground. Instead, the Leper King raised his bandaged hand at exactly 2 p.m., the signal his knights had been praying for. 500 lances dropped to charging position. The impossible attack had begun. But Saladin had missed one crucial detail that would doom his army. His forces were split by a natural feature invisible from distance, a series of ravines cutting through the plain. What looked like open ground was actually terrain that would funnel fleeing men into death traps. Baldwin, despite his youth, had recognized what Saladin's experience had missed. The Muslim army's reaction tells us everything about their shock. Elite Mamluks, warriors who'd faced Byzantine cataphracts and Nubian cavalry without flinching, simply froze. For precious seconds, they couldn't process what they were seeing. 500 men charging 26,000 wasn't warfare, it was mass suicide. Saladin himself, watching from his command position, dropped his golden mace, an action his chroniclers faithfully recorded, unable to hide their master's shock. "Madness," he whispered. Then louder to his panicking officers, "Form lines, form lines." But forming lines takes time, and Baldwin had given them none. The Crusader charge covered 300 yards in under a minute, 500 ironclad horsemen moving like an avalanche, their battle cry of Deus Vult, drowning out Muslim commanders' desperate orders. The Templars, forming the spear point, aimed directly for Saladin's still-forming centre. At 500 yards, Muslim arrows began falling like rain. Knights fell, horses screamed and tumbled, but the charge never wavered. At 200 yards, the full terror of what was coming became clear to the Muslim front ranks. These weren't just knights, they were fanatics, men who believed death in battle guaranteed paradise. The Templars especially, with their black and white banner streaming overhead, came on like demons from Christian hell. At 100 yards, something extraordinary happened. Baldwin himself, strapped to his saddle, bleeding from stress-reopened wounds, raised his sword. The gesture was impossible. His diseased hands shouldn't have been able to grip the weapon, yet every chronicle, Christian and Muslim alike, records it. The Leper King was leading from the front. At 50 yards, Muslim horses began backing despite their riders' efforts. Animals sensed doom, and doom was seconds away. The ground literally shook under thousands of hooves. Dust clouds rose like smoke. The noise was indescribable thunder mixed with war cries in 3 languages, the clash of weapons being readied, prayers screamed to 2 different gods. At 2 p.m., under the scorching Levantine sun, Baldwin raised his bandaged hand and unleashed hell. 2 p.m. struck like the hammer of God himself. The Templar wedge, 80 knights formed into a human spear, smashed into the half-formed Muslim centre at full gallop. The sound was like mountains colliding, a crash that men 5 miles away claimed they heard. In those first seconds, 300 Mamluks simply ceased to exist, crushed under hooves or transfixed by 12-foot ashwood lances. But the real shock wasn't the impact, it was what followed. Instead of wheeling away after the charge, the Templars did the unthinkable. They kept going, driving deeper into Muslim ranks like a blade seeking a heart. Behind them, Baldwin's 420 secular knights struck in a second wave, exploiting the gap torn by the warrior monks. 2:15 p.m. brought the first impossible moment. Saladin's centre, 8,000 of Islam's finest cavalry, began to buckle, not retreat buckle, like a dam cracking under pressure. The Muslim commanders couldn't believe their eyes. How could 500 exhaust knights be pushing back 16 times their number? Then something happened that defied all military logic. The Crusader horses, exhausted from their forced march, should have been failing. Instead, they fought like creatures possessed. War horses bit and kicked, adding to the carnage. One Templar horse, its rider dead, continued charging through Muslim ranks, trampling warriors, spreading panic by its very existence. 2:30 p.m. saw panic begin its deadly work. A Mamluk regiment on Saladin's left wing, seeing the centre collapse, began edging backward. In battle, hesitation is contagious. Within minutes, the backward drift became a stream, but then came Baldwin's masterstroke. His 3,000 infantry, hidden in dead ground, suddenly appeared on the Muslim flank. The psychological impact was devastating. To Saladin's already rattled forces, it seemed Crusader armies were materializing from nowhere. Shouts of "We're surrounded" spread through Muslim ranks, militarily nonsense, but panic doesn't calculate odds. The impossible was happening. 26,000 warriors were being routed by a force they outnumbered 52 to 1. 2:45 p.m. marked the moment when battle became massacre. As Muslim forces tried to flee, they discovered Baldwin's tactical genius. Those ravines that looked like escape routes became death traps. Knights pursued fleeing Muslims straight into these natural killing grounds. The chronicles describe horrors: men trampling each other, horses with broken legs screaming, warriors throwing away weapons to run faster. But then the unthinkable happened. At 3 p.m., Saladin's personal guard 2,000 Mamluks, who'd sworn to die before abandoning their sultanate, broke. These were men who'd faced Mongol cavalry without flinching, who wore their scars like holy relics. Yet faced with Templars who fought like men seeing paradise, they ran. Saladin himself, watching his invincible army disintegrate, made a decision that would haunt him forever. Abandoning his horse too slow for escape, he mounted a racing camel. The sight of their sultan fleeing on a pack animal shattered the last Muslim resistance. If Saladin ran, what hope did common soldiers have? 3:30 p.m. saw pursuit become annihilation. Crusader knights, their blood up, chased fleeing Muslims for miles. The killing was mechanical, efficient, horrible. Lances broken, they used swords. Swords blunted, they used maces. Some Templars, their weapons lost, beat enemies to death with their helmets. The very ground became slippery with blood. Modern historians still can't explain this part. How did 500 exhausted knights maintain pursuit for 2 hours? How did horses near death from marching find strength to run down fresh Muslim cavalry? The Christian chroniclers had an answer. God's strength flowed through them. The Muslim chroniclers, horrified, agreed. This was divine punishment. 4 p.m. brought scenes that haunt the records. The ravines, those natural features Baldwin had recognized, became charnel houses. Muslims fell in layers, the dead cushioning the dying suffocating under more dead. Some ravines literally filled with bodies, creating bridges of flesh others tried to cross. The pursuit only ended when Crusader horses finally collapsed, their mighty hearts giving out after achieving the impossible. Baldwin himself fought despite agony that defies description. Strapped to his saddle, unable to feel his sword hand, he nonetheless led charge after charge. Knights later swore they saw tears of blood seeping from beneath his silver mask, his diseased body literally weeping from the effort. Yet his voice never wavered, calling encouragement, directing the slaughter with tactical brilliance. The Templar Grand Master, Odo de Street Amand, provided the battle's most chilling moment. Finding a group of 500 Mamluks trying to rally, he led just 12 knights in a charge that shattered them. When asked later how 12 could break 500, he replied simply, "They feared God's wrath. We embodied it." Statistical shock comes from every angle. By 4:30 p.m., Muslim dead carpeted the field for 3 miles. Bodies clogged the ravines 20 feet deep. Abandoned weapons littered the ground like iron seeds. The streaming banners of Islam's greatest army lay trampled in mud made from dust and blood. But the numbers that truly stagger come from Muslim sources. Of 26,000 warriors who woke that morning, fewer than 2,000 saw sunset. The Crusaders lost 1,100 dead, heavy losses from just 3,500 engaged, but nothing compared to the Islamic catastrophe. It wasn't a defeat, it was annihilation on a scale medieval warfare rarely witnessed. As the sun began to set on that blood-soaked field, the impossible had become reality. The setting sun of November 25th illuminated a vision from Revelation itself. Where Saladin's mighty host had stood that morning, only corpses remained. 20,000 Muslim dead, the number staggers even now. Bodies lay so thick that Crusader horses picked their way carefully, like walking on a carpet of the fallen. The ravines had become mass graves, filled to overflowing with warriors who died not from wounds but from suffocation under their fleeing comrades. Baldwin, finally allowing himself to be lifted from his horse, collapsed immediately. Knights rushed to support their dying king, but he waved them away, insisting on one final act. There, on that field of death, the Leper King led his exhausted army in prayer. "Non nobis, Domini, non nobis," they chanted. "Not to us, Lord, not to us, but to your name give glory." The sight of 500 blood-soaked killers kneeling in prayer while surrounded by 20,000 corpses struck even hardened warriors as surreal. But wait, it gets more insane. The immediate material gains defied calculation. Saladin's army had carried wealth to sustain a long campaign: gold, weapons, horses, supplies for 26,000 men. In 3 hours, it all became Crusader property. The chronicles list the haul with awe. Enough weapons to equip 10 armies, enough gold to fund the kingdom for 2 years, thousands of horses, including Arabian breeds worth fortunes. The Templars alone captured enough military equipment to outfit every Christian fortress in the Levant. More importantly, they captured Saladin's war chest, literal tons of gold meant to pay his army. In one afternoon, the bankrupt kingdom of Jerusalem became solvent. The economic impact would sustain the Crusader states for a decade. Saladin's humiliation was complete. The man who'd never known defeat arrived in Cairo with fewer than 2,000 survivors from his 26,000. His racing camel had saved his life but destroyed his reputation. Warriors who flee on pack animals don't inspire loyalty. His emirs, the same men who'd been dividing up conquered lands that morning, now questioned their sultan's judgment and courage. The Muslim chronicler Ibn al-Athir, usually sympathetic to Islamic causes, couldn't hide the scope of the disaster. He called it the most terrible catastrophe to befall Islam in this age. Another wrote simply, "God turned his face from us that day." The psychological impact on the Muslim world was devastating. If 26,000 couldn't defeat 500 Christians, what did that say about divine favor? Jerusalem erupted in celebration when news arrived. Church bells rang for 3 days straight, but in the royal chamber, Baldwin IV lay dying. The battle's physical toll on his ravaged body was catastrophic. Physicians warned he might not survive the night, yet somehow, impossibly, the Leper King endured. When asked how he'd found strength to fight, Baldwin whispered, "Pain means nothing when God requires service." The strategic implications were staggering. Saladin's power base in Egypt nearly collapsed from the defeat. Syria questioned their allegiance. The careful alliance he'd built over decades cracked in a single afternoon. Military historians calculate it took Saladin 10 years to rebuild a force comparable to what Baldwin destroyed in 3 hours. The Crusader states, granted this miraculous reprieve, gained time they'd never dared hope for. But the real consequences were beginning. The Battle of Montgisard stands as history's most extreme example of odds overcome through leadership, faith, and tactical brilliance. For 10 years after that bloody November day, Saladin approached the Crusader states with newfound caution. The man who'd swept all before him had learned that numbers alone don't guarantee victory, not when facing an enemy willing to die for their cause. Baldwin IV continued his impossible reign for 8 more years, each one a medical miracle. The boy who shouldn't have lived past childhood commanded respect from enemies who outnumbered him 50 to 1. Even as his body literally fell apart by the end, he was blind and couldn't walk. His mind remained sharp, his courage unbroken. When he finally died in 1185 at age 24, Saladin himself reportedly said, "I feared that man more than any army." The tragic irony strikes hard. Just 2 years after Baldwin's death, Saladin reconquered Jerusalem. Without the Leper King's inspired leadership, the Crusader states crumbled. The kingdom Baldwin had saved with 500 knights couldn't survive without him. It poses the eternal question: do great moments make great leaders, or do great leaders make great moments? Montgisard was the last great Crusader victory, the final time Christian knights dominated a major battlefield in the Holy Land. Every subsequent battle saw Muslim numerical superiority translate into victory, which makes Baldwin's triumph even more extraordinary. He achieved something that should have been mathematically impossible, that violated every principle of medieval warfare. But here's where it gets even more profound. Both Christian and Muslim sources agree something supernatural occurred that day. How else to explain 500 defeating 26,000? How else to understand exhausted horses outrunning fresh ones? How else to comprehend a dying teenager outgeneraling history's greatest Muslim commander? When faith meets superior numbers, can sheer will overcome material reality? Modern military academies study Montgisard as the ultimate example of psychological warfare. Baldwin understood something Saladin missed. In battle, morale matters more than mathematics. 500 men who believe God fights beside them are worth more than 26,000 who doubt. The Leper King's true genius wasn't tactical. It was making his knights believe the impossible was inevitable. The battle's legacy echoes through centuries. When Churchill spoke of their finest hour, when 300 Spartans held Thermopylae, when any hopeless stand succeeds against overwhelming odds, we see Montgisard's shadow. It remains proof that sometimes, just sometimes, courage counts more than counting. That dying boy with bandaged hands had done the impossible, but at what cost? Baldwin saved the Crusader states, but couldn't save himself. His victory bought 10 years of survival for a kingdom doomed by demographics. He proved faith could move mountains, but learned mountains eventually move back. In the end, Montgisard stands as history's most glorious last stand, a moment when the impossible became reality, when 500 stood against 26,001, when a Leper King's bandaged hands held back the tide of history itself.